I gave a previous talk about 18 months ago where I kind of gave an overview about what climate change is, what the impacts are going to be, and what action needs to look like. And this talk is kind of conceptually a follow-up to that one, providing a kind of, as the title says, a progress report on where are we actually at with that. So welcome. Let's talk about that. So first of all, 2020 has been pretty terrible. So I just want to say up front that I really appreciate you still coming to a talk about climate change. You would probably benefit from having a stiff drink around. This is not a kind of light topic, but I hope that I'm going to be able to provide you at least some kind of reasons to be a bit hopeful. Basically, I'm as sick of 2020 as the rest of you, and in this talk, I will be trying to give you some good news, but with climate, that's fundamentally a really hard job. There are lots of good reasons to be angry and upset about the state of climate action, but I believe that there are some small but real reasons to be hopeful. But I want to be clear about how I think about hope. In the words of Rebecca Solnit, I say all of this because hope is not like a lottery ticket that you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. I say it because hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency, because hope should shove you out the door, because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the Earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action. Action is impossible without hope. This talk is going to be split up into 5 parts. I'll start by telling you about the dire state of global emissions. I think this is the most depressing part, unfortunately. I'll then talk about recent developments by some key countries and some of the broader global trends. I'll tell you about how companies are taking climate action. Finally, I'll tell you about what all this means for COP26 in Glasgow next year. So let's talk about global emissions first. This is how global emissions have changed over the last 20 years. As you can see, emissions have continued to climb. The rate of growth has slowed down, but we haven't even begun the process of reducing global emissions yet. The last time when emissions reduced for a single year was the 2008-9 financial crisis, and emissions growth rebounded very quickly after that. In 2020, COVID lockdowns caused an estimated 7% drop in annual global CO2 emissions. This sounds like a really good thing for the climate. However, to put this in perspective, according to the 2019 UN Emissions Gap Report, we need to reduce global emissions by 7.6% every single year in the 2020s to remain on track for 1.5 degrees Celsius. The UN have been producing emissions gap reports for 10 years now. This graph is from their 2011 report and forecasted business as usual emissions in 2020 without any climate action as being 56 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. In reality, the emissions in 2019 were 59 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. In other words, the last decade of climate action has only been sufficient to keep emissions growth in line with what we thought would happen if we were taking no climate action. So this is the challenge that we're facing. We've never seen a sustained reduction in global emissions, and we need to immediately begin and sustain one through the 2020s. For a 2 in 3 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have a total remaining carbon budget of 310 gigatons, as in that's the total amount that we can emit for the entire rest of this century and beyond. If global emissions don't decline, then we will have spent this budget by 2028. Worse, the IPCC actually recommends shrinking that global carbon budget even further by an additional 100 gigatons to account for the long-term risk of carbon feedback loops and tipping points. And so as you can see on this graph on the right-hand side, the gap between where our current policies are taking us and where we need to be by the end of 2030 is measured in tens of gigatons. The dire state of global emissions means that all pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius are expected to require large-scale deployment of negative emissions technologies. This is likely to mean capturing and storing 10 gigatons of CO2 a year by 2050 and up to 20 gigatons of CO2 a year by 2100. For comparison, the total natural global land emissions sink is about 20 gigatons of CO2 a year. So we're talking about building planetary scale negative emissions technology over the next century to meet the kinds of targets that we're trying to shoot for. Deploying negative emissions technologies at this scale will make CO2 management one of the largest global industries, equivalent in scale to food production, which is 15 gigatons a year, construction materials, which is 60 gigatons a year, and fossil fuels, which are 20 gigatons a year. None of the required technologies have been deployed at any meaningful scale yet, and we need to scale them in the next 30 years. In a very real way, we are gambling our futures on unproven technologies. "2020 has been a year of perpetual breaking news. I don't know what your experience has been like, but I've definitely found myself kind of checking almost daily, like for the latest headlines of this like slow breaking global situation where today is very much like yesterday, but it's somehow addictive to check what's happening today. In this section, I want to slow down a little bit and give a longer-term view of climate action in a few countries. So in the UK, way back in 2008, we passed the first legally binding emissions reduction target in the form of the Climate Change Act. It set a long-term target and established a system of 5-yearly carbon budgets starting in 2008. It also established an independent body, the Climate Change Committee, who would regularly review government progress and recommend future carbon budgets. This structure has actually been quite effective and has been replicated in several other countries around the world since. In 2019, there were two major developments. Following XR protests in October 2018 and April 2019, the UK Parliament passed an opposition motion to declare a climate emergency. Now, this was largely a symbolic act. It was an opposition day motion. It had no legal force. It didn't bind the government to do anything. However, only a month later, the UK government increased our legally mandated target to be net zero by 2050. In June of this year, the Climate Change Committee published their annual report on government progress on meeting our carbon targets. This report shows that UK emissions up to 2020 have actually declined as planned. However, we are not on track for meeting the fourth and fifth carbon budgets. More importantly, the fourth and fifth budgets were set before the net zero target was set. The sixth budget will be set in 2021 and will provide the crucial medium-term goals against which policies will be measured. The other key thing to know about UK emissions reductions so far is that they've come almost entirely from emissions reductions in power generation, as it happens largely from shutting down coal power plants due to, I believe, EU air quality regulations. However, to meet our future targets, emissions are going to need to decline across all sectors. In particular, buildings and transport emissions need to start dropping rapidly. The main paths forward here are quite clear. For transport, we need to rapidly switch over to electric vehicles and increase the use of walking, cycling, and public transport. For buildings, we need to mandate the building of energy-efficient buildings and start a massive program of retrofitting homes to make them more efficient and change how they're heated. It's still the case today that new homes are getting built that are not up to the standards that we know they're going to need to be up to. The other important perspective on UK emissions is the difference between territorial versus consumption emissions. Territorial emissions refer to the greenhouse gases emitted within the UK. Consumption emissions adds on the emissions embedded in all the products which we import. This is an important distinction as it doesn't really count as success if we reduce our emissions whilst also increasing imports from other countries which still have much higher emissions. Sadly, this is exactly what has happened. The UK's consumption emissions have declined much less over the last 30 years, although thankfully they are now beginning to look like they're in decline. One of XR's 3 demands is for the creation of a citizens' assembly to consider the evidence about climate change and make policy recommendations. This is an important demand because a citizens' assembly can make recommendations without being limited by political considerations. Citizens' assemblies have been used in the past to settle controversial political issues, such as the legalisation of abortion in Ireland. In June of 2019, 6 Commons Select Committees made a joint announcement that a citizens' assembly would be held in the UK. A group of 108 citizens were selected to gather and consider the topic. In September of this year, they submitted their report, which indicated broad support for a wide range of policies. This will be a useful tool for providing further political legitimacy to climate action. In November of this year, the government released the 10-point plan. This set out a range of policies to drive down emissions, and it's a good first step. However, the government's own forecasts show that the 10-point plan only delivers about half of the emission savings which we need to meet our existing carbon budgets, which were actually agreed before we set a net zero target. So we're still making plans to do far too little. In December, the UK published its revised nationally determined contribution. This is the Paris Agreement targets set by a country. This is the first one we've been able to publish directly rather than being part of the EU target. This is actually an interesting benefit of Brexit. We increased our 2030 ambition to a 68% reduction, and this as well is a really important step in the right direction. And then published today, I actually spent some of my lunch break reading some of this 448-page report. The Climate Change Committee have published their advice on the 6th carbon budget, and they're recommending that we should be aiming for a 78% reduction in territorial emissions by 2035. The key next, and it's important to note that that's just a recommendation and that will then be legislated at some point in 2021. The key document which we're still waiting for, which will get released at some point in 2021, is what's called our net zero strategy. And this is what promises to set out how the government will actually bring their action in line with their net zero commitment. And this is something which I actually saw in the 6th carbon budget advice, is the Committee on Climate Change were specifically calling out that government plans should lay out savings that actually match up to what's required in the carbon budgets, which is presumably a bit of a call out of the 10-point plan as being insufficient. So hopefully we'll get some better action on that next year. Over in the EU, they've also been holding citizens' assemblies. Ireland's actually reported back in April of 2018, and France's reported in 2020. In December of last year, the EU actually announced the European Green Deal, which was a €1 trillion investment plan to work towards net zero. This was followed in July 2020. As part of the EU response to COVID, they released, they announced a 750 billion next generation EU stimulus fund. And importantly, 30% of this money is committed to be spent on climate action. And then in November of this year, the EU announced their latest 7-year budget. And again, 30% of this money is committed to be spent on climate action. The key thing that we're waiting for out of the EU at the moment is for them to release their revised nationally determined contribution. and it looks like that's likely to be 55 to 60%, which is lower than the UK's 68%, and is a result of the EU having to get agreement across the entire area, which is challenging. The US is a really interesting country to talk about with climate action, because back in June of 2017, Trump announced that he planned to leave the Paris Agreement. And this didn't actually take effect until November of this year, and Biden has vowed to rejoin the Paris Agreement on his first day in office. And so the US won't end up being out of the Paris Agreement for very long, like a matter of, a couple of months. But that decision really galvanized a lot of action at the subnational level. And so the very next month, America's Pledge was launched, which was a coalition of US cities, states, businesses, and universities who pledged to fulfill America's Paris commitments. And in 2019, their report estimated that emissions could be reduced by 37% by 2030 without any federal support, and that adding federal support could drive emissions reductions to 49%. Now, obviously, the biggest news this year is that Biden won the US election. And this means that there are some big reasons to be hopeful about US action in 2021. I think probably the most important isn't actually direct climate action. It's that the US is going to need to deliver much more economic stimulus to recover from COVID. And Biden will have the opportunity to green this stimulus to build back better. Now, Biden also promised a dedicated $2 trillion climate plan. This would be a huge win, but Biden is going to face serious challenges trying to get this kind of spending through the Senate. So I find myself excited and nervous to see what Biden can get done here. Finally, Biden will get to define the US's new nationally determined contribution. This will be an important public commitment about the level of climate ambition to expect from the US. Now, China is a really interesting case. China is the world's largest single carbon emitter. On the other hand, Chinese GDP is still 5 to 6 times smaller than US GDP, and their per capita emissions are about half as much as the US. China has historically been reluctant to commit to emissions limits, as they have been worried that this would slow down their growth. And this is why it was such huge news that in September 2020, China committed to peak their emissions by 2030 and reach net zero before 2060. This is a massive step in the right direction. Unfortunately, on the other hand, this means that the largest carbon emitter does not plan to substantially reduce their emissions by 2030. This means that to reach a global reduction in emissions of 45% by 2030, all other countries need to reduce by much more than 45%. In March of 2021, we'll get more details when China publish their next 5-year plan, which will include their detailed climate targets. The other exciting news from China, and that this has actually been happening over the last several years that they've been working up to this, I'd not heard of it before, is that they're actually in the process of launching a national emissions trading scheme, which will put a price on carbon. And this is a really important policy mechanism that will give them a way of putting all the incentives in the right places to decarbonize their economy. So I want to talk now about a few global trends that have been happening. The climate crisis is mostly caused by the burning of fossil fuels. Incredibly, governments around the world continue to massively subsidize fossil fuels, and this is just completely insane. The G20 actually pledged to phase out fossil fuel subsidies back in 2009 with no target date, and then did basically nothing. The G7 pledged in 2016 and added a target date of 2025. Again, very little progress has been made. It appears to be politically very difficult to withdraw these subsidies, presumably because that means making things like petrol or electricity more expensive. In better news, in August of this year, BP became the first major fossil fuel company to set an explicit target to reduce their production volume by 2030. And in December of this year, Denmark became the first country to end new oil and gas exploration. This is the estimate of annual climate finance flows. The world currently spends over $500 billion a year on climate finance. I find that quite a useful number to know to put other figures in context. So when you hear Biden talking about a $2 trillion climate plan, well, I mean, depending on how many years that's spread over, that's a substantial amount of money compared to the amount of money currently being spent on climate. However, to put this in perspective, the IPCC estimates that the required investment is at least 4 times higher than this. This would only be 1.4% of global GDP, but we're currently only spending 0.35% of global GDP on tackling climate change. This is a graph showing the incredible growth in electric car sales in Europe. In July 2020, electric vehicles overtook diesel sales for the very first time, and petrol car sales are also in decline. The UK recently announced that diesel and petrol car sales will be banned in 2030. It's important to note that the EU is doing particularly well at the moment with electric vehicle sales. The picture in other regions is a bit more mixed, with some growth slowdowns in 2019 and 2020 for a variety of reasons. But the kind of direction of travel is clear. Like these are the kinds of graphs we're going to see more of in the coming years as we see a fundamental decline in diesel and petrol sales and electric vehicles taking over the market. Economists have argued for a long time that putting a price on carbon is the best way of incentivizing the required transitions in the economy. Frustratingly, this has proven politically difficult to actually deliver. However, I found it really interesting to find out that progress has still been made. Once the Chinese emissions trading scheme is fully operational, 14% of global emissions will be covered by an emissions trading scheme. There's also been huge progress in the number of countries adopting net zero targets. There are actually 127 countries responsible for around 63% of emissions who are considering or have already adopted net zero targets. Climate litigation has become a key avenue for holding governments and companies to account. There have been some important wins in recent years. In December of 2019, the Danish Supreme Court ruled that the country had a duty to protect its citizens' human rights by taking stronger climate action. In February of this year, the third runway at Heathrow was blocked by the UK Court of Appeal because the planning permission hadn't taken account of the Paris Agreement. Interestingly, some climate activists have actually successfully justified their actions in court based on the urgency of climate action. In January of this year in Switzerland, a dozen climate activists who had been charged with trespassing for occupying a Credit Suisse branch to protest against the bank's fossil fuel investments had their convictions overturned. On appeal, the judge concluded that because of the imminent danger of the climate crisis, the protesters' actions were necessary and proportional. Similar defences have had some success, with historic decisions made in France and in the UK. In France, a criminal court in Lyon found that climate activists had stolen portraits of the French president, Emmanuel Macron, out of necessity to call attention to France's failure to meet its climate targets. In the UK, a protester arrested after spray painting 2 XR symbols onto the headquarters of Cambridgeshire County Council was found not guilty on the grounds that she was acting to protect her land and home. However, most defendants over the past year have not been so lucky. In September, a Polish judge demanded that the operators of the largest coal plant in Europe must negotiate with environmental lawyers to swiftly reduce its impact on climate. This single coal plant burns a ton of coal every second and has approximately the same annual carbon emissions as New Zealand. So how are companies responding to the climate crisis? The Science Based Target Initiative was launched in 2015 to support companies in setting climate action targets that align with the scale of action required. This is a key initiative to prevent companies from greenwashing with weak targets. Instead, targets are rigorously assessed to make sure they line up with the scale of action required by science. So far, 1,093 companies have committed to set a target, and 526 companies have had their targets signed off. 360 of these companies have 1.5 degrees Celsius compliant targets, and the remaining targets are 2 degrees Celsius compliant. In October of 2019, Amazon was the founding member of the Climate Pledge, a new coalition of companies committed to reach net zero by 2040. There are now 18 companies who have signed up. Amazon has announced 2 related investment funds. Launched in October 2019, the Right Now Climate Fund is supporting nature-based solutions which remove or avoid carbon emissions. They have already made their first $14 million of grants across 2 projects. The Climate Pledge Fund is supporting new technologies that will enable companies like Amazon to drive down emissions. They have made their first 5 investments, which included a company called CarbonCure, who are developing reduced CO2 concrete. The Bezos Earth Fund is one of the largest ever charitable donations. In November, the first round of donations was announced, with $791 million being awarded to a range of environmental charities and organizations. Now, $10 billion is a huge and very welcome commitment. However, it's worth noting that Bezos' personal wealth has increased $70 billion in 2020. For comparison of scale, the total assets of the Gates Foundation, the single largest private foundation in the world, are about $50 billion. This autumn, Amazon launched the Climate Pledge Friendly program. My current team were involved in this launch. This is the first little step towards the future of shopping, where products which are better for the environment are promoted to customers. There is clearly much more to do here. It needs to be as easy as possible for customers to reward companies who are taking the climate crisis seriously and selling products which are genuinely better for the environment. COP26 was meant to happen this year in Glasgow. The COVID pandemic caused it to be pushed back to 2021. I think there are a bunch of related reasons to think that 2021 will actually be an exciting and critical year for climate action. The new Biden presidency will rejoin Paris, set a new nationally determined contribution, and actively participate at COP26. China's new 5-year plan will set crucial targets related to climate change. Around the world, governments will spend huge amounts of money on economic stimulus to recover from COVID. We have a critical opportunity to use that spending to accelerate climate action. These post-recession moments are rare and provide a rare kind of window where it's much more acceptable for government to widely interfere with the economy, and that's what we need to change to fundamentally redirect the economy in a new direction. Interestingly, in February of this year, Bill Gates announced that the Gates Foundation would add climate change as a new focus area. This will add important extra energy to global coordination efforts. The Climate Action Tracker is an organization who have been forecasting the trajectory of climate change since 2018. They are tasked with looking at all of the different national commitments set around the world and figuring out where they're taking us. At the start of December 2020, they published a major update that forecast what would happen if all the countries who have committed to net zero targets actually managed to deliver on that commitment. The result is their optimistic targets estimate of 2.1 degrees Celsius in the year 2100. When I read this, I almost cried. There is still a huge gap between the promises being made and the rate of actual delivery, but this is the first time that I've seen a credible pathway which gets us close to 2 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees Celsius is still far too warm and will cause massive harm, but 3 degrees would be apocalyptic. In many ways, the world is slowly getting to grips with climate action, but the scale of our effort is still far too small compared to what is needed. We have to be realistic about where we stand today. For all the talk of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's simply not possible by now. The required rate of change is implausibly large. We have left it too late. In fact, it looks like it's going to be very challenging to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. This means we'll likely tell our kids about coral reefs in the same way that we'll tell them about the dodo. However, 2 degrees Celsius is still a world which we can plausibly adapt to. It's not a world which I want to live in. It's worse in very real ways than the world we live in today. But it's a world which is still much better than the even worse alternatives. For now, we have to use our hope for a better future to motivate us to act, to get on with making the changes which need to happen. The faster we achieve this, the better the outcome that we'll get. I believe that 2021 is going to be a critical year for setting the direction of travel. From 2010 to 2015, Cristina Figueres led the delivery of the Paris Agreement. In 2019, she helped found the Climate Pledge. And in 2020, she published a book called The Future We Choose. In this book, she wrote, "It's time to participate in non-violent political movements wherever possible." The architect of the Paris Agreement says that now is the time for non-violent direct action. It is critical for us all to remember that change is possible. There is a long history of victories which are all too easy to forget. Once a fight is won, it becomes the new normal, and we forget that we ever had to fight for that normal. In the words of Rebecca Solnit, most environmental victories look like nothing happened. The land wasn't annexed by the army. The mine didn't open. The road didn't cut through. The factory didn't spew effluents that didn't give asthma to the children who didn't wheeze and panic and stay indoors on beautiful days. They are triumphs invisible except through storytelling. Together, we are very powerful, and we have a seldom told, seldom remembered history of victories and transformations that can give us confidence that yes, we can change the world because we have many times before. You roll forward looking back, and telling this history is part of helping people navigate towards the future. We need a litany, a rosary, a sutra, a mantra, a war chant of our victories. The past is set in daylight, and it can become a torch we can carry into the night that is the future.